Hey, it's Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch Network, here with a look at Trump's first year. We'll also look at what's in store for the U.S. economy in 2026, along with a key indicator that threatens to unwind the global economy no matter what rabbits this administration thinks that it can pull from its hat. And we'll lead with that part first, because it's a shocking development in the financial markets that the administration and the mainstream media are papering over, because it seems like everyone is just crossing their fingers that AI is coming to the rescue in 2026. Spoiler alert, it's not. This is the macro take from MeidasTouch. Let's go. So as promised, we're going to start by talking about the thing that no one's talking about in the financial markets, but everyone should be paying attention to. But first, let's start off with a rare moment of truth from our president.
And after just 1 year, we have achieved more than anyone could have imagined.
How unusually true, sir. The orange fellow is actually going to be our guide for much of today, since he laid out his case so eloquently for why the economic pain that you're experiencing right now is all in your mind, and certainly wouldn't be his fault if indeed you are struggling. But first, here's what's gotten away from this administration and reveals everything about how tenuous the U.S. economy is. The repo market. Now, before you roll your eyes or you glaze over or you click away from the video, this is an important concept to understand. Now, we've covered it before, so I'm just going to do a very brief overview of why it's so important, because it'll show you just how crazy this financial data really is. So every night, trillions of dollars flow through the plumbing of the financial system. These are giant settlements between counterparties, somewhere in the neighborhood actually of $12 to $13 trillion every day. So there are clearinghouses, these intermediaries that account for all of it. And some banks and even non-banks facilitate these transactions by loaning out money to cover them until the morning. For this service, these intermediaries take pennies. But on trillions of dollars, it adds up. So this is a robust business in and of itself. Now, the borrowing rates between the parties are set by the market. This is called the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. But the Federal Reserve also participates by setting a ceiling to these rates, the federal funds rate. So this is the range of rates currently between 3.5% and 3.75% that you hear so much about. So when the Fed talks about hiking rates or cutting rates, that's what they're talking about. So when the market demands rates outside of this range, when SOFR blows out, the Fed will step in to securitize these settlements by loaning money against assets, either mortgage-backed securities or U.S. Treasuries, that the counterparty's holding on their balance sheet. So this has happened more in the fourth quarter of this year than at any other time outside of a financial crisis like COVID or the global financial crisis. Now, it can happen on occasion at the end of a fiscal quarter, like on the very last day of a quarter, when firms are making big balance sheet moves prior to reporting financial data, but it rarely, if ever, happens outside of quarter ends and financial crises. And yet, here we are. This is how often it's been happening in the fourth quarter of 2025. All those blue lines represent billions of dollars that the Fed had to inject into the overnight markets to keep rates within the target range. So what does this mean? I'll tell you why the markets are ignoring this and why it's so bad. When this has happened in the past, market observers freaked out because it can imply some sort of liquidity crisis, like maybe there's a hidden collapse somewhere in the system. But because the Fed has the tools to intervene so swiftly, the markets no longer overreact, especially when it's an isolated event. Now, a sustained period like this signals something different. And it's one of the reasons why you're seeing a flight to hard assets like gold and silver. Right now, institutional investors and central banks are growing wary of plumbing issues like this, because it implies that the parties that have visibility into one another's activities don't like what they see. Elevated rates like this means that banks are asking for a premium to supply liquidity. It's a risk premium. So there's something happening in the credit markets that's spooking banks and NBFIs, non-bank financial intermediaries, that are big enough to participate in them. They're like dogs circling each other and growling. Now, they might just sniff your ass, but they also might bite. So it's all very uneasy. So what does this mean in practical terms for you and me? It means that for as much as the Federal Reserve would like to see interest rates come down, the market has other ideas. These interbank rates are a proxy for the credit crisis that is currently enveloping the U.S. consumer and therefore the entire economy. And here's an example. The 10-year Treasury is the Goldilocks rate that a mature economy is based on. It's a realistic time frame, unlike the 30-year, and therefore it's the benchmark rate for things like home mortgages and credit cards. So despite proclamations like this,
I've secured a record-breaking $18 trillion of investment into the United States, which means jobs, wage increases, growth.
the market isn't buying it. Despite the tax refunds for consumers and seniors on Social Security, tax cuts for businesses, deregulation making business easier, tariffs incentivizing domestic productions, the markets see it differently. The cost of U.S. debt, which is all a Treasury yield is, remains higher even though the Fed is cutting rates and Trump is bragging. This is just another risk premium, only it's the whole world asking for it from us. Now, even though I said it's a benchmark for credit cards and mortgages, it doesn't mean it's a tether. So it's a guide, not a tie. But you know this much. Spreads for consumer credit aren't going to be lower than these rates, so the cost of your mortgage or your credit card debt is going to remain elevated for the foreseeable future. So why is the world basically shorting the US economy right now? Because we're so in debt. Not the country, although that's a symptom, but you and me as citizens. And that wouldn't be as much of a worry if there was a way out of our indebtedness, but right now we're in a credit spiral, and it's about to get a lot worse. Now, we shared in our most recent Midas report that household credit card debt is at an all-time high, so I won't rehash that. But let's talk about why this is. There are really two primary inputs: wages and inflation. If the cost of your life is more than what you make, then you go into debt to make ends meet. So how does the president feel about these inputs? Well, let's start with inflation.
I am bringing those high prices down and bringing them down very fast.
Bringing them down and bringing them down fast. Well, I tried to include as many comparisons as possible, but it looks to me like prices are still pretty elevated. See, consumer spending is 70% of US GDP, so the price of goods and services matters a lot to our economic health and our consumer finances. If we eliminate the massive 20-month spike under Biden post-COVID, Trump's numbers are flat and now even higher than when Biden left office. So he's actually managed to reverse the trend despite plunging the global economy into a recession. The economy is so bad, how bad is it, that oil is in the 50s and inflation is still around 3%. While we shed a record number of jobs, which itself is in spite of the fact that Trump has deported around 350,000 people and shut off immigration entirely. We should be experiencing deflation, if not disinflation, and neither's happening. And if you're saying, Max, to be fair, inflation fell in the last report, right? Well, according to the Trump administration, it came down from 3 to 3.1% to 2.7% based on, well, actually, let's look at what they based it on. All the numbers are missing. How would we know what inflation is when they literally didn't collect 90% of the data? But look, that's not the whole of Trump's argument. So in addition to the claim that he's brought down inflation, which we don't know, the more important piece of what's going on is that wages have grown. Take a listen.
And for the first time in years, wages are rising much faster than inflation.
Okay, well, now let's take a look. This is wage growth adjusted for inflation. It's hovering around 1%, or to put it another way, flat to where Biden left off. Okay, so we've got inflation and we've got wages, and he's making certain claims that really aren't backed up by the data. So then it really comes down to, I guess, the total number of people who are actually working, right? I mean, if he's saying that wages are outpacing inflation, even if we take him at his word, which nobody ever should, but even if we do, then how many people are working, right? That's the right question.
Very importantly, there are more people working today than at any time in American history.
Oh, more than ever before. Wow. Okay, let's fact check that. Okay, except that labor participation was higher when Biden left office. And I guess you also have to exclude every administration going back to Gerald Ford. And in that case, he's right. All right, look, there's a reason that Grandpa is screaming like this.
1 year ago, our country was dead. We were absolutely dead. Our country was ready to fail, totally failed. Now, we're the hottest country anywhere in the world.
He's angry because you're not grateful. How can you have any pudding if you don't eat your meat? In fact, you're so ungrateful. How ungrateful are you? That despite everything he's done for you, the new ballroom, tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, $20 billion to bail out Argentina, war with Venezuela, his family buying up Bitcoin, you still have no faith in him. Consumer confidence is at the lowest point ever, meaning never lower. Not during COVID, the GFC, dot-com bubble, the 1970s even. Ever. We're in a deep recession. No more talk of this K-shaped nonsense. 711 firms filed for bankruptcy through November of this year. That's the highest since 2010 in the aftermath of the GFC. That's up 14% over last year alone. 41,000 households also filed for bankruptcy this year, up 8% from last year. And we're coming up on the time that bankruptcies actually spike come March and April. So we're not even in the peak season for it yet. So now let's add it all up because the picture starts to get really clear. The financial market plumbing, springing leaks almost weekly. Consumer confidence, all-time low. But household debt is at an all-time high. Fewer people are working. Inflation is still ripping, and we haven't even hit the worst of it yet because the big pin pop that signals the collapse hasn't even happened yet. And so what's the pin? Is it the AI bubble? The private credit markets? War with Venezuela? Stock market correction? Nah. I mean, these might all get swept up into it, but the big pin might not even be in America. As we've said before, the monetary crisis in the US might start in Japan because the Japanese economy is falling apart. Now, what does that have to do with us? Well, because inflation is on the rise in Japan, the Bank of Japan, which is their Fed equivalent, has started to raise interest rates, and they just signaled at their last meeting that they intend to keep raising them in 2026. This has already had an impact on us. How? Well, that's a good question. It shows up in a roundabout way that plays into everything we just covered. You see, Japan is the largest sovereign holder of U.S. debt, and that's because the rates they pay on their treasuries has been next to nothing for decades. And now that their central bank is raising rates, we're beginning to see something called the yen carry trade unwind. The long and the short of it is that it's been advantageous to take advantage of a depreciated yen to convert those yen into dollars to buy U.S. treasuries. And since Japan is still such a huge economy and their treasuries are starting to pay more, Japanese capital is starting to repatriate. This is just the beginning of an already bad situation, as you can see here. In the most recent Treasury International Capital, or TIC data release, the United States saw an outflow of dollars from both private and official sources. And it's hard to impress on everybody just how significant this is because it confirms the notion that US dollar dominance and exceptionalism is finally over. In other words, not only does the rest of the world now believe the US is on the wrong trajectory, but it also believes that it has viable investment options outside of the United States. And we can see it in our last slide today. US dollar holdings, or foreign exchange reserves, are near an all-time low, which makes this claim even more spurious.
I've secured a record-breaking $18 trillion of investment into the United States, which means jobs, wage increases, growth.
The translation for all of this global macro data is that the Sell America narrative is very real. And the result of it is that our cost of capital is going to remain very high. Mortgage rates, credit cards, lines of credit, you name it. And with flagging consumer sentiment, we're headed for a bloody 2026, for the consumer at least. And this lack of confidence means people stop spending, which will eventually eat into corporate earnings. So we'll see even more stress in the private credit markets, more Fed interventions, and tighter credit all around. See, this is how economies come to a grinding halt. And look, some of this is par for the course. Capitalist economies are built to boom and bust. Recessions are a feature, not a bug. But over the years, we've learned how to intervene to limit the amount of pain that's felt throughout the economy. But the Trump administration has already signaled that the levers will be pulled exclusively for the banking sector. The entire Trump economic plan is built around this idea that your tax refunds will be so enormous, a theory that we already debunked again in our last video, that it'll lead to an economic boom. But the math just doesn't pencil out. So looking ahead, here are the factors to keep an eye on, because the existential threat to the U.S. economy goes beyond whether there's an AI investment bubble, a war with Venezuela, or even a stock market correction. So, will the yen carry trade unwind lead to panic selling of U.S. debt? Will inflation resume once we get the actual data to fill in the blanks? We already know the labor market is cratering, but will the official figures finally match what we all know is true? And will the dollar continue to lose value relative to our counterparts in the world? Because these trends will lead to something else. In the immediate, they can combine to pop the bubble, to lead to severe downturns in myriad sectors, and with healthcare costs set to skyrocket and tariffs and dollar devaluation continuing to pressure inflation, the consumer's screwed. And these things alone can cause the credit markets to seize, which means the Fed will have to flood the financial system with dollars to prevent regional banks in particular from coming apart at the seams. But the long-term effect of this kind of spiral is the flight away from the dollar as reserve currency and toward a new regime that probably looks like stablecoins backed by BRICS currencies and precious metals. And these things are already in the works, which means that any kind of U.S. long-term recovery will require something more than just data centers and coal plants. Which brings us back to the beginning.
And after just 1 year, we have achieved more than anyone could have imagined.
This reckoning might have been a long time coming, but it's also the case that it was still several years, if not decades away. What Donald Trump might have pulled off in this second of his first years is to bring this faraway reckoning right to our doorstep. That's your macro take from the MeidasTouch Network. I'm Max from UNFTR, and you can connect with me on Blue Sky at UNFTR and find me on YouTube by the same handle. Make sure also to visit UNFTR.com to sign up for our free weekly newsletter and read our archive of original essays and source material. Thanks for sticking to the end, and I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.